Welcome to Tillamook Museum's Literature and Culture Author Conversation Series. This virtual discussion was made possible thanks to funding from the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, New England Foundation for the Arts, USDA Rural Development, and people like you. You too can support programs like this by making a tax-deductible donation to the Tillamook Museum. Christine DeLucia is an assistant professor of history at Williams College and was formerly associate professor of history at Mount Holyoke College. An award-winning author, her articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, the William and Mary Quarterly, Native American and Indigenous Studies, New England Quarterly, and other venues. She teaches and is involved in public humanities projects centering Native American and Indigenous studies, material culture, place-based ways of knowing and remembering, and decolonized approaches. Please enjoy.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this question because in hindsight, there's all kinds of ways to make it seem like a natural, seamless thing. But in fact, I did not set out intending to write what eventually became this book, Memory Lands. In fact, earlier in life, I thought I was going to be a journalist. I really liked talking with people and having conversations, trying to make sense of different points of view, how to tell when someone was telling you a really important story, how to know when you were being perhaps lied to by figures of authority, right? And so that was really formative to me as a younger person. And then in college, I can remember this very clearly, there was this kind of aha moment when I took a class about the Native Northeast and had never academically encountered anything on this topic before. And it was so eye-opening to me. Lisa Brooks, an Abenaki scholar who's actually speaking through this series later in June, offered this course. And part of what was so striking and unsettling to me was that Lisa and I had grown up in very much the same area in northern New England. And her family was Native, mine is not. And we had these utterly different understandings of place, of community, of various erasures that have happened over time. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. And that experience of being so dislocated from what I thought I knew, despite having had a wonderful high school history experience, there was nothing about the Native Northeast. And that made me want to not just know more, but find ways of doing something to address those mythologies and misconceptions that are so damaging and so profound in the educational system and elsewhere. So all of that eventually wound up turning into a book. But the other thing I would say about this, I'm still kind of fascinated by the fact that this thing exists on paper because there are so many stories, pieces of information, sources of knowledge that are not in here. And that might be something for us to chat about as well, what has made it into this published form, and then what often for incredibly important community reasons is not in a book. So I realize that's a little bit of a strange way maybe to frame a book, but it's actually really vital in Native studies, Indigenous studies, in terms of what is shared, how it is shared, and also what is not shared.
No, that's an interesting idea of there's things that are not in the book. And do you want to talk a little bit about that now? Because that really piqued my interest, why those things were included and why the things that, as you were inspired to write this book, you spoke a little about that, but what inspired you to put those particular things as opposed to others?
Yeah, so the book wound up, it's a study of memory in the Northeast and how Native, colonial, and colonial communities have engaged with particularly the 17th century, but also much longer pasts, how they have made sense of this, erected monuments, engaged in other kinds of commemoration. And a lot of the research process, I hesitate to even call it research because it feels like it's something bigger than that, really involved conversations and relationships, beginning to build relationships with community members, and the kinds of long-term interactions that take place often very organically, such as meeting someone out by a river or by a swamp or by a particular monument and having these, as you know, these conversations that just go in so many directions. And at no point did I ever feel even remotely like it would be appropriate to have a tape recorder out there recording people, because that itself can be a very sensitive thing when someone's words are then, as you know, taken into other formats. And so I was mostly just taking notes or mentally, keeping track of what we talked about. And when it came to then writing this, I wanted to be really sure that what wound up in print were the kinds of knowledge and stories that were actually desirable and appropriate for public consumption. And there are many of those. I would say that's actually the majority of things that we wound up talking about, things that people really want to be known because they have been left out of some stories or erased or downplayed. But there were other places, and here I'm just going to speak very generally because it is about the topic of what's not in here. For example, certain places where they don't appear on any of the maps in the book, they're not in the footnotes, they're not in the main text. And that might be because it's a particular place on the land that is incredibly sensitive and where there has been, for example, a history of vandalism or looting that has really targeted native places, including burial sites, sacred places where non-tribal members have gone in and extracted, physically what is there and disrupted that incredibly important landscape. And when people shared that information with me, it was not in a first conversation, it was not in a second conversation, it was only after we had been talking for some time. And it was with the understanding that I would never publish that, right? Or I would not share the details because that would be potentially incurring more harm. And I mention all of this because I think it's really different than how a lot of academic history and even popular history tends to get produced, where there's often a desire or pressure to put everything out there or sort of claim that an author has discovered something. And that felt to me very contrary to the purposes of this. And I also know that some historians disagree with that and have said things on the note of, well, aren't you concealing things? I said, well, this is actually a really sensitive and important thing to talk about. And I don't come to these decisions lightly. This comes out of 400 years of knowing what some of these impacts have been. And so, Sylvan and I were chatting just a little bit before we started that as much as we can talk about what's in the book, there's also what's not in the book. And for me, there's an ongoing process of learning more about what is most appropriately held within a community that is not for outsiders, and what is important to share out. And this process, or this book, I should say, really brought me into the weeds of that, trying to think through different approaches to research and writing, and then sharing this work out.
By doing your research in that way, you're doing the work of decolonizing research. We talk about decolonizing museums and giving respect to tribal communities to have a say in how their cultural belongings are shown, are shared, and what things should not be. And that's been an ongoing discussion and sometimes disagreement. So it's really interesting to hear that you've been doing that in your research, and it's kind of a new way of looking at research. And I appreciate your work in that way.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for mentioning it. So that phrase, decolonizing methods, I hope everyone has some kind of interest or understanding of that. There's a book by that name, if you're interested, that the Maori scholar Linda Tahiwai Smith has written. And I keep saying to academic colleagues, everyone needs to read this. It doesn't even matter what field you're in. Everyone should read this because it is about rethinking the nature of intellectual production, knowledge, and who benefits from it, who is harmed by it, and the long histories of that. I will also say, and I think we're going off script from what the questions are, and that is awesome. I'm really glad to do that. That as part of this process, even back in graduate school, it seemed to me important to share the writing that I was doing with community members with whom I had spoken, to hear their responses if they were interested in sharing that, find out if there were things I had gotten wrong or needed to be corrected. And I will say this, I have never been more anxious about sharing work than with community members, because the knowledge that they bring to it is profound. By that standard, academic reviewers are easy. You can deal with them. But community members bring this whole other level of experience and knowledge. And at no point in sharing work in process like that did I feel like anyone was trying to censor or say, you can't do that. To the contrary, it was always incredibly thoughtful constructive criticism, such as, oh, you write about this document or this place. Have you thought about this? Or actually, you're missing this piece of the story, which would be so important to bring in to give the fuller sense. And all of that I tried to acknowledge in the, the official acknowledgement section, but it goes so much beyond that, the debt of relationships and people taking the time to interact with a piece of writing along the way.
With that in mind, much of history of Indigenous people is rooted in oral traditions. And so it's kind of, thinking of Memory Lands, where did your research start and where did it end up? Were there surprises that you found along the way while doing that research that influenced how this book turned out?
Yeah, I love this question. And I feel very fortunate that that class I mentioned that I took in college with Lisa Brooks was my introduction to how to do work in a decolonizing way. And something Lisa Brooks has always stressed that I think I have carried forward is that written archives are important. We use them, and they should never be the beginning or the end of the research process, because there's so much that is not in them, or because they are written so frequently from a colonial point of view, an English point of view, and in the case of the materials I work with, that to keep recentering those written documents can perpetuate these erasures of Native experiences and Native voices. So that was something I brought into this, knowing that I wanted to look at written things, but that they should never be the fullness of the story. And so the process along the way became this really, I keep saying organic because it just felt natural, that say I would read something and then I would have a conversation with someone or visit a place, and then it would lead me back into the archive and then lead me back into conversation. And it felt all just intertwined along the way, rather than now I'm reading things, now I'm talking with people, now I'm going out on the land. Instead, it was very wrapped up, all these different components. And from the perspective of written archives, there are kind of a couple things I wanted to mention about that many of them, including from the 17th century, the era of King Philip's War, have this oral quality to them. And what I mean is that a lot of the documents, even those written by, say, English legal authorities, were often transcriptions of some kind of, say, verbal testimony that someone was giving. It could be in the course of a court proceeding or a land case or something like that. And so you're getting, albeit indirectly, Native people's own descriptions of their experience. The challenge is that it's so filtered through the colonial mechanism, and it often is a document designed to shore up colonial goals. So that's one of the things to have to wrestle with. But there are these traces, and there are way more of them than I think many academic scholars have recognized. There's this notion out there that there isn't an archive, a written archive about Native experiences. That is absolutely untrue. It's rich, it's deep, and Native people in the Northeast have been writing in English language as well as their own languages since the 17th century. If we're talking about writing on paper, there of course are much longer standing forms of recording and wampum and place-based knowledge, but there is this huge archive, and it's really rich, and I think people have glossed over it. So that is one of the ways that I've come at these, these methods. And then the talking with people. I think that might sound kind of casual, but it's actually a really rich and important way of deepening one's understanding. And sometimes those conversations impressed upon me just how many generations of Native communities have actually been reading and wrestling with these same documents for centuries, right? And some of that has happened through federal recognition proceedings, through tribes' own genealogy work, through community-based histories. And so there's this extraordinary familiarity. I mean, I'm thinking here of Nipmuc, Narragansett, Wampanoag, Mohegan communities, many of whom themselves also maintain archives. And yet it's not just the archive itself, it's the knowledge that surrounds it, right? And so that was some of the most important components of this for me, developing a better, more accurate interpretive lens for these written sources.
For those who haven't read Memory Lands, I know this isn't the next question, but I think it might be helpful to give a little synopsis of what the book was about and how, because it starts with King Philip's War and this place of violence in the Northeast. I'd like to hear more about, like, what do you mean? For those who haven't read it, what does that mean?
Yeah, so the short version of what this book is about is revisiting the conflict, the really devastating conflict, sometimes known as King Philip's War, in recognition of the Pokanoket Wampanoag leader Metacom, or King Philip, and the ways that this profound violence that took place between about 1675 and 1678 has shaped the telling of history, the lived experiences of many different communities, the politics in this region, sometimes called New England. And my motivation for writing it was partly deep frustration at how other historians have characterized this war, which seemed to me to miss extremely significant dimensions of Indigenous sovereignty. So not just about kind of culture, but actually about political autonomy. And also a frustration with the generalizations, as if this war meant the same thing to everyone in all parts of this region, when in fact, when you go into really particular places, the course of this war looked very different, the motivations for being involved and the consequences of it. And so I really wanted to pull out some of those nuances that are actually really significant to understanding this. The other, I mean, the keyword in the title about the place of violence, part of my own interests are in environmental history and place-based work. And I wanted to go further into place itself as a way of knowing, as something of huge ancestral significance and contemporary significance to tribal communities, and also to colonial communities, though in very different ways, and to think about place as a way of reapproaching the past. And so a lot of what you'll see in this book is me, literally going out to swamps and rivers and monuments and golf courses and these really specific terrains that were key in the waging and then remembrance of King Philip's War, to see what's happening out on the land. And as I think, Superman has gathered from this book, on one level, it is about King Philip's War. On another level, it goes way beyond that. And so in the course of this, learning process, it became extremely apparent to me that the story could not begin in 1675. It needed to begin at the beginning, since time immemorial, in deep time, and to account for Native communities' long-standing presences in this region. And then to see the colonialism of the 17th century as a particular moment in time, but not as the kind of unprecedented breaking point that it's often presented as, but rather part of a series of changes. And then it went right through the 21st century, because when I was talking with people, out in all these places, no one began their story with in 1675. The story began in lots of different moments in time, from, this is a place where I fish with my family, to this is a place where there's a Superfund site that has poisoned the land, to, this is where we had this encounter with the state police that was really fraught. And that, sometimes I feel like I'm very slow at learning these things, but over time, I realized that the story is also about the 21st century and the ways that what has happened centuries ago continues to shape, for example, actions, legislation by the state of Rhode Island or the United States Supreme Court in ways that are incredibly colonialist and perpetuating these, I keep saying erasive, what do I mean by that? These colonial narratives that presume King Philip's War is the end of Native people and the end of Native sovereignty in the Northeast. That is not true. And yet these mythologies have this, just like, I'm lacking words here for the nature of the impact that has in K-12 curriculum, museums, public signage, monuments. I mean, we could be here all day listing the impacts of that. And so the book then became, I want to address these things. I want to understand where these came from and then critically speak back to them. So that's kind of the arc of what it became.
I think when I first, Loren handed the book to me, my first interpretation was, this is a history book. This is something that's going to be reflective of the King Philip's War. And then when I started reading through it, I'm like, I was really stunned by how many times it also connected with things of today. That's what stood out for me, because I wasn't expecting that. Like you said, how actions of the past are still impacting us in the present. So it's when we teach schools about how to teach about Native people, we ask them not to keep us in the past, but also that we are still presently here in what's happening now. So I was really pleased that this book kind of brings you there and has a little bit of that too, so that people know we're still here, these things are still happening. So just want to make that plug for the book, because I think it's a lot more than someone might even think just from looking at the cover. Now, where's my questions? Because I get all, now I've got into all of my own thoughts and interests. Can you share your favorite passages and describe why that they're important to you?
Thinking about this, and it's a strange thing to think about a favorite selection from a book that in so many ways is about violence, because I was thinking about the author process. This was a very taxing book to write, and I also I'm quite attuned to how I experience that doesn't even begin to compare with how communities who have lived through this, where this is very emotional material. It has to do with massacres, violence, dispossession, and it was a struggle to find ways to write about this that are appropriate and respectful, and, as you were saying, recognizing the continuance. So a couple things I was thinking about, and then I'll share a couple slides to give you some visuals. I really wrestled with how to write about Great Swamp in Narragansett homelands, which I think, as most people here know, was the site of a devastating massacre in late 1675 as King Philip's War was gaining momentum. And it caused unspeakable harms, casualties, prisoners taken among Wampanoag and Narragansett people. Narragansett people had taken in Wampanoag relations to protect them. And among those who were targeted by this colonial violence were women, children, and elders, as well as men, and also their corn supplies and their homes, right? And so it was this kind of scorched earth tactic. And it took me so long to think about a way to write about this. And what I wound up doing was not actually beginning the chapter with any kind of narration of that violence, but rather writing about the swamp as a very long-standing place, full of life, full of animals and birds, sustenance, a place of power. It's some of it is inundated with water, some of it is dry. It really changes with the seasons. And if you have ever had a chance to go to that swamp or other swamps, if you walk through them, they are so alive. And that to me seemed important to convey rather than going directly to this moment of violence. Because the swamp has continued and people's connections with these places have continued while also acknowledging that violence. So I'll mention that in case people want to think about the kind of the challenges of writing. But let me briefly share my screen, because I wanted to say a little bit about a portion of this project that was eye-opening for me, that has been known in some very serious ways among communities, tribal communities, for generations. And for me was an occasion to try to pull together some pieces. And this has to do with the taking of Native people as prisoners during and towards the end of King Philip's War, and by the English, and selling them into enslavement or indentured servitude. So various systems of bondage and unfreedom. And this story is devastating. I think it is not in the popular history books yet in the way that it ought to be. So let me just share a couple images and talk about this path. So back to that point, that there are these rich, important archives. This is one of those kinds of sources. This is a document from 1676 that is an indenture. So a labor agreement sending a 4-year-old Native boy into servitude for the English. And among the complications of this document are that the young Native boy had been taken captive by the Mohegans, right? And so the Mohegan tribe, during the course of this war, for reasons of their own sovereignty and self-protection, were in many respects aligned with the English, right? So this is a more complex story in which all Native people are not taking the same actions or engaging in this in the same way. And this comes out of Mohegan's own experiences with English colonialism and violence. And so, a document like this, asking us to think about Native children and the futures that they represented and what kinds of violences were being caused intergenerationally as Native children were taken from their kinship networks, and in cases like this, sold into English households, right? I'll also say about this document that, items like this are often the only time, or maybe one of a few times, when a particular Native child or person might be named in a written record. And so it can be really tough to try to follow out their life story beyond this moment. But we always need to recognize that their life went on, even if it's not made visible through these written archives. As part of this, I also began finding these other moments when Native people were taken captive. And, I think that word doesn't even begin to do justice to the nature of that violence and the harm that was caused. But I'll say taken captive. And the example I wanted to share that might be especially resonant for this audience has to do with a Narragansett woman and her young son, who are mentioned in a document from the Piscataqua River region. So this is in northern New England. It's actually today acknowledged in colonial terms as the boundary between New Hampshire and Maine. So as you head over the Piscataqua, and there's this one mention in a colonial diary by someone named Samuel Sewell, who happened to own property up in this region. So that's why I think he was writing about it. That mentions that this Narragansett woman, who's not named, and her son, who's also not named, are caught while they are trying to run across a piece of a tree that has fallen across the river. They're trying to cross the river to safety, and they're taken captive. And when I saw this initially, the diary entry, I couldn't make sense of this. Why is this Narragansett woman and her son this far north? Where is she going? And gradually, it became apparent that this was a larger story about Native people from southern New England, Wampanoag, Narragansett, particularly Nipmuc, moving north as a strategy to seek shelter and safety among Wabanaki communities, who to this point had been able to maintain much more distance from this conflict and much more autonomy. And she's interrupted, right, in that moment of trying to save her son and herself. And what happens to her after this? It's hard to say based on context. I write in the book that it's likely she was sent down to Boston, because many Native people who were taken captive in this northern region were sent to Boston. I think it's important for us to name Boston as a slave trading port in the 17th century. Contrary to the city on a hill mythology you might have heard, right? Boston is a slave trading port, and Native people being sent there. And from there, hard to know. But one of the things I wound up tracking in this book, just to describe briefly here, is this larger geography of what I wound up calling a Native or Algonquian diaspora. So a spreading out, in this case, against people's will. And this map is one depiction of this huge Atlantic world geography into which Native people were sent as prisoners as enslaved people. And as you can see from this, right, Wabanaki is on here. That is not a condition of enslavement. That is seeking shelter among relations, and also up here in Canada. But these other locations, including, you can see all the way over to Tangier in North Africa, and all the way down to the Caribbean and to Bermuda. So this is one of the last parts of my book, tracing out this much bigger geography and making it apparent that I am not the first person to think of this, right? And it's actually tribal communities who a number of years ago began making connections with St. David's Islanders in Bermuda and forging these relationships as a way of counteracting the massive disruptions caused by enslavement. But just to show, I think, yeah, here's one more. So on this notion of the archive, right, this document is not in New England, and yet it's all about Native people from New England. It is in the Public Record Office in Kew in England, just outside of London. And I came across this in 2009, right? So ages ago. And it stopped me in my tracks because other scholarship I had read didn't think this document existed. What it is a letter from an English ship captain named Thomas Hamilton, who was in charge of a galley ship in Tangier, North Africa, what is today Morocco. And the English had a colonial outpost there. It didn't last very long, but it lasted during the period of King Philip's War. And what he's writing about, where you can see this giant arrow, he's talking about 30 Indians. And what he's describing are 30 native people taken from New England during King Philip's War and sent to North Africa in part of what English authorities hoped would be the start of a potentially very lucrative trade in enslaved native people. That wound up not being the case in North Africa for a variety of reasons, but documents like this are so important. They don't tell the whole story, but they often open these windows onto this kind of space. So maybe by way of concluding this question, one of the big aspects of this project that the story is still very much unfolding has to do with the ways that Native people from New England have traveled globally, often very much under duress. But sometimes of their own volition, right? In the case of these Bermuda reconnections. Oh, and wait, there was one more slide. Wait, well, I still have this up here because I don't want to be jumping from screen share. I did want to mention this because it's really connected to Narragansett as well. So we had talked a little bit about what happened to Great Swamp and Native prisoners taken from here and sold into slavery, as well as the massacre that took place. Something that I was utterly unaware of before I began this project was that the colonial troops who took part in this violence against Narragansett and Wampanoag people benefited monetarily and in terms of land from that military action. And what I mean by that is that I wound up finding all of this evidence of what were called the so-called Narragansett Townships, numbers 1 through 7, in places nowhere near Great Swamp or Narragansett homelands. They're in fact in north central Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. And these were granted to the colonial veterans of this massacre years later. In some cases, those veterans had died, and so the land then was allotted to their heirs. But to me, this is a really potent illustration of how colonists benefited from taking part in this violence. They literally got land from it. The other complication from this is that the Narragansett Township names get changed over time. So they go from being called number 3, number 4, number 5 to Bedford, New Hampshire, or pick your other towns. And so there's been this erasure through local history practices. And I wanted to share this because I grew up about here in Manchester, New Hampshire, actually neighboring these Narragansett townships, and I had not a clue about it. And the only trace of this that I could see on the land today, here, I'll stop sharing, when I went to Bedford, New Hampshire, one town over from where my folks live, is that there's a building called the Narragansett Grange. And if you don't know this history, you would have no idea what that name means. And it's in fact connected to this dispossession and this violence. So those are some of the seeds that I'm hoping to plant with people to go and revisit critically their own local histories. And most likely we'll find many, many connections and traces of these events in the 17th century.
That's really incredible research. When you were talking about Bermuda, it was making me think of the reconnections that were made with our relations that are now residents of Bermuda from over 200-300 years of displacement. And what was always incredible to me about that was, even though they were taken away from here, away from their family, their relatives, they never forgot that they came from this place, that they were our relatives, our relations, that their ancestors were brought there from the tribes of New England. And I thought that was incredibly powerful to the value of oral tradition and oral history, that those stories get passed on. And one of our guests tonight, James Murphy, he wrote, "I am looking for Indigenous oral history sources to balance out the written history, which is lopsided. I'm particularly interested in memory places." So my question was kind of back to talking about oral research. How did you make those connections to find people that you could speak with when you were doing this research?
Yeah, not an easy or straightforward process, in part because of 400 years of violence. And, you know, I come to this as a non-native person, and communities have and ought to have all kinds of suspicions, questions about why someone might be, you know, researching something. And so finding ways to talk about this project, to think about this project as potentially being able to support communities' own goals. Like a really small example of this, I was doing some research in the Rhode Island Historical, I'm going to forget its full name, Heritage Commission, the State Archaeology Office, right? They have documents there, and a really amazing collection of newspaper clippings that the former state archaeologist Paul Robinson had collected over the years while working with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And I asked him, I said, can I take pictures of these as I go? And I realized at the end of this, I then had this, you know, digital archive of sources. And I said, can I share this with people? And so then pass that along in case that's of use to people's own research. But on the notion of making connections, some of it was I would talk to one person and then they would say, you really need to talk to so-and-so. Here's their number, you know, call them, don't email, get on the phone, show up in person. And that to me became an important method in this, if I can even call it a method. A big part of it, I think, was showing up and like getting in the car and going places rather than assuming that people should travel to you. And it might sound, you know, bizarre to even have to state that, but there's often a sense of entitlement, I think, in academia that everyone should just come to you, when in fact you're the one making a really big request of people. And I think, you know, more than anything else, communicating that I'm a teacher, you know, that's what the day job is here, and that one of the goals of this work is to be sharing out with next generations of students, college students, but then also working with K through 12 educators through workshops and NEH institutes and other things, other ways to do this work, ways to bring in other voices, other experiences. And, you know, to the question that was asked in the chat, I have this that I always like to hold up, giant book called Dawnland Voices, an anthology of Indigenous writing from New England that came out a couple of years ago. And there's wonderful Narragansett material in here, as well as from many other tribal communities. And I would definitely encourage this as one point of entry, because tribal community members contributed to this as writers, as editors, and made some often challenging decisions about what to share in this published form. And there's a lot there that could then be a starting point for thinking more broadly, as well as knowing who in communities is really doing cultural preservation work, tribal historic preservation work. And there's often an office, you know, that's charged with that, or a museum or a cultural center, which could be a place of a really good connection, such as the Tamaquag, of course.
That's one of my favorite books. We sell it here in the museum, so I've gotten to peruse it on more than one occasion as I'm in this space, and I love all of the varied voices in it. I loved what you said about showing up. It's about building rapport with people within the communities and coming to them. I think that's really important, and people don't often realize that if you're asking someone to share, you really need to build the relationship first. Some of my earliest memories was the historian William Simmons, and he was interviewing my grandparents, and he would come and visit with them, and he became a friend. And my great claim to fame is I made it into one of his books, because I used to always run away up to my grandparents, and I was sitting on their lap on the porch when he took a picture that made it into one of his history books.
Oh, that's great.
It became a part of the community. You became a part of our relatives here, so that people feel more comfortable with sharing. I think building that rapport is really important. That's a part of that showing up. We had another question. It was a really good question. Let's see if I could find that. James Murphy asks, can you expand on the intriguing sentence from your book that place has remained a crucial conduit of memory?
Yeah, so place-based ways of knowing. What does that mean? The land as a repository of ancestral knowledge, of recent controversies, of different kinds of being marked or unmarked. I'm thinking here of the many oral traditions, really deep time oral traditions across the native Northeast about how the land came to take the forms that it has. For example, in Aquino-Wampanoag, something that's very actively interpreted there by the Aquino-Wampanoag tribe are the cliffs at Gayhead, these beautifully striated, multicolored cliffs. And from a geological perspective, there's one way about talking them. From an oral tradition perspective, right, that these were shaped by Moshup and that they go back to the very earliest moments in time, and that they're deeply connected to Moshup providing for the people and making space for the people. And so, some ways of understanding place as having those millennia deep stories. I think for me, one of the issues I've had with the field of environmental history, and this often comes out if you're visiting a national park or something like that, it's talked about as wilderness or sort of pristine nature. And that language is actually coming from a particular cultural point of view that makes it seem like the land is not a native place, or that doesn't have this long-standing ancestral connection and tradition of stewardship. And whenever I see something, about wilderness, my radar kind of goes off and wonders how to tell the story differently. Another example that that I talk about in the book is the place called Pesquiamscot, which is a beautiful waterfall along the middle part of the Connecticut or Connecticut River. And it also was a site of violence in King Philip's War, much in the way the Great Swamp was in May of 1676. And one of the ways that people have re-engaged with that place is recognizing how fertile it is, that this is a fish run, that one of the reasons why tribal communities were there in May of 1676 was because they had been gathering at the waterfalls for 8,000 years, probably longer. The archaeology at a minimum says 8,000 years. Oral traditions suggest, much more than that. And that is a story of sustenance, that if you can understand that landscape, that is not just about people, it's about people and the fish and the water and the seasons, and why people would gather there in springtime after a long winter and in the course of this war being deprived from necessary food resources, right? Then you see this place in this utterly different light. Whereas most of the colonial accounts make it appear kind of inexplicable. Why were the native people here? But if you understand it within that deep time geography, it then has this whole other kind of meaning. And if you go out there today, right, you can see through the land itself the kind of the nature of these stories. It also has a monument on it, and maybe on that count, let me share one more slide here because this is important to the kind of the process of the book. So if you go out by Pesquiamscot these days, you'll see this monument. It's a terrible monument in the sense of colonialist monuments that tell one version of the story. In this one, it describes the fact that an English military leader named Captain William Turner, quote, with 145 men, surprised and destroyed over 300 Indians encamped at this place. Whenever I show this to my students, I say, what do you notice about this? And they say, it doesn't name the native people who are here. You have no sense of what tribal nations they are from. You have no sense of what is causing this. The word surprised seems to be quite a euphemism for the extraordinary violence that took place here. It was a massacre. And this monument, which was erected in 1900 by colonists, has long just kind of stood there, uncontested, although not really. And so one of the ways that I wound up using place as a lens in this book was tracing out how this monument actually has been contested. I also wanted to say that this picture postcard from the earlier 20th century, it tells you a couple things, right? That this was a kind of scenic location that colonial people thought was, of interest to visit. I don't think really reckoning with the violence. And then also want to recognize that my friend and colleague Kathleen Brown Perez from the Brothertown Indian Nation saw this in an antique store and got it and then gave it to me and said, I think you would want this for your own archive, right? So people often give me things in hopes that I, can do something with them. One of the most interesting things for me was tracking how this monument has been revisited over time. And this comes through archival research on the left-hand side and place-based work on the right-hand side. So just briefly, I found this great photograph in the collections of historic Deerfield, right in this region, from 1999, as part of a local news item announcing that under cover of night, unknown people had dumped blood red paint over this monument and stenciled the American Indian Movement slogan, Free Leonard Peltier, on top of the monument. And to me, this was immediately obvious that this was not an accidental or incidental choice of location. This was such a pointed message, asking people to recognize Indigenous continuance and to rethink colonialism, right? And so this is part of the archive. It got cleaned up though, quote, meaning the graffiti. I put graffiti in quotes because I think it's, what do I call it in the book? An editorial intervention. The marking got cleaned up because the town thought that it should be, restored to its monument state. But then, by happenstance, when I was out doing research in this area in 2011, during winter, as you can see from this picture, I nearly drove off the road because I noticed that at another time, someone had remarked the monument with marks that I'm not entirely sure what they mean. But I, again, am convinced that this was not accidental, that appeared on this monument in red paint, a kind of a question mark with a line through it. I don't know exactly what that is. But this, I would say, is another way of thinking about place and how to write histories of place that are much more complicated than just this. So always needing to be listening to places where monuments or other sites are being contested. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that in this location, I write about this as well, now more than a decade ago, the town of Turner's Falls, which, as you may note, is named after William Turner. So thinking about place names as actually honoring and reinscribing colonial violence, the town of Turner's Falls began to reach out to tribal nations and to think about building other kinds of relationships. And Narragansett were part of that and have been part of these revisitations in recent years. And this is one image from what was called a reconciliation ceremony that took place there. And so the story goes on, right? This may not be visible if you go out to the monument today, but this event is really part of the story and is not the end of the story. I think that is what tribal participants in these events have stressed. It's not ending something, it's opening doors, opening possibilities for different types of collaborations and relationship building, with the emphasis that the work is not finished and the work has only just begun by that much. So I realize it's a little bit of a long answer, but those are some of the ways that, focusing on place can help you see these changes over time, as well as long-term continuities.
No, you brought up a lot of really good themes in that. Even the idea that that's not the end of the story. And it's funny that you decided to focus on Pesquiamskut, because just within this past week, I saw a Facebook post from tribal members from my tribe, Wampanoag, Mohegan, that had gathered at Pesquiamskut to fish together. And so there's a reclaiming of that land for what it's, what it used to be remembered for, and kind of taking ownership of that space again by tribal communities. Even returning to our place names, which place names in native languages, when you translate them, they're talking about the use of that place, the memory of that place, what that place was for. So there's so much more meaning in those names. We are almost at 7 o'clock. I had a couple more questions that I just wanted to throw out quickly. Given conversations around monuments, like you just were talking about at Turner Falls, the land back protests, actions at the Capitol, how does your work speak to these pressing issues?
Yeah, so I mean, it was so eye-opening, especially last summer, as Black Lives Matter momentum gained, a lot of traction, and there is this massive conversation happening around monuments to the Confederacy, also monuments to colonialism, many of these coming down or being revisited in important ways. And I will say, as I was working on this book, there were many times when colleagues would say sort of like, monuments, that's sort of esoteric, or that's really niche. And then all of what happened last summer made me feel like, yes, this has been a longstanding topic of importance. But within that, I also want to stress, as I do in the book, that communities have been contesting these monuments for ages. And that was one of the most important parts of the research, to be seeing that, stone markers and signs and plaques have long had this pushback or critique or intervention from tribal communities, that didn't start in 2020, it goes a long ways back. And there are particular moments in time when that kind of comes up. For example, in the 1930s in Rhode Island, when the tercentenary in 1936 is getting underway, but also before that and a little bit after that, there's this big wave of putting up monuments in Rhode Island. And like, truly one of the reasons for that is that a state commission gets some funding to put up monuments. And so you see this just, a ton of monuments and markers going up. And even then, in the 1930s, there's this critique. And one of the things I get into in the book that I think is, very close to the Tamaqua Museum is the publication, The Narragansett Dawn, published by Princess Redwing, with a lot of community contributions from across the Native Northeast. And there are just, there's so much in that publication, including because it comes out in the 1930s at exactly this moment when all of this colonialist stuff is going up, when you can see Narragansett people, Wampanoag people, other relations engaging in their own forms of commemoration, speaking back, sometimes in very strategic ways, collaborating, and I put that in quotes, collaborating with the Rhode Island state organizers. For example, I was just reading a section from the Narragansett Dawn that's talking about a so-called Indian village that was created at Goddard State Park in 1936, built and used as an educational site by tribal members. And there's so much going on in that, right? That in some ways, I think they were contending with just this massive wave of colonial focused, English heroic commemoration, and finding ways to make sure that Narragansett people were present and that their own continuance and sovereignty were being emphasized. Keeping in mind that it was only in the 1880s that the state of Rhode Island had illegally tried to detribalize the Narragansett tribe and dismantle the reservation lands, right? And so that's, within a generation of really direct memory. And those moments of kind of interaction, pushback, critique, I think are some of the most important in this book. That I'm just documenting what has happened, but really giving credit to everyday community members who did this work, often unpaid, because they knew that it was important to make sure that their experiences, their ancestors' experiences, were represented accurately. And so, those are some of the passages that I think most about the 1930s, but also the mid-19th century. And there's these kind of waves of commemoration that come and go. I think we're in the midst of another, I'll say, interesting one. If anyone has followed in Wampanoag homelands, all of the commemorations around 1620 and the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, what has happened in 2020 is radically different from what happened in 1920. And a lot of that owes to the concerted efforts of Wampanoag tribal members who have undertaken all of that organizing and labor through, documentary production and traveling exhibitions and hosting conferences, even while COVID was happening, to make sure that that commemoration was not a monovocal something, but instead something that recentered Wampanoag experiences. So None of that fit in the book because the book came out in 2018. But I would, I would love for someone or many people to be writing the history of our own moment right now and the different shapes that memory is taking, especially in the age of social media. And that's like a whole other discussion. But I think there are ways that communities are leveraging that to get around mainstream media, for lack of a better phrase, and using it to self-represent in a much more widespread fashion, their own experiences, and using video and photography and recordings to get those perspectives out there.
Maybe it's a second edition for yourself even. With that said, before we open up for questions, just tell us if you can share with the audience a little bit about where they can learn more about you and your work and any future projects you have on the horizon.
Yeah, so let me see if I can put this down in the chat. I built a website a couple years ago. I was very ambivalent about that, but it turns out it's a good place to share out some resources. One of the things I would point people to on this website, there's a section about land acknowledgements because like you, I have gotten a number of questions in recent times about land acknowledgements as institutions or individuals are seeking to acknowledge where they are. And I've shared out some examples and resources on that. Thank you as well for the link to the book. The current things that I'm working on, I enjoyed writing the book. I more enjoy projects and collaborations that are, as we've been saying, much more about relationship building and sort of the process. And so among the things going on these days are, I'm now at Williams College in Western Massachusetts, which is on, as I said, Stockbridge, Muncie, Mohican homelands, and beginning to do relationship building with the tribal community and their historic preservation office, and finding what it means to actually be doing reparative or restorative justice work through an institution that Williams College is named after the colonizer who dispossessed the Mohican people. So how to bring these things, into the 21st century in a way that is much more accountable, and to bring in young people and students and education at every point in that. So that is a process that's happening. I'm also working on a second book about the 18th century and its connections with the 21st, because something that I noticed while working on the first book was that in a lot of scholarship and popular history and also museums, there has been a tendency to end the story around King Philip's War and to describe Native communities in the aftermath of that, including around the time of the American Revolution, as marginal or living in enclaves or sort of completely displaced from their homelands. And to me, that never made sense. It never matched up with how communities have talked about their own histories. Their own histories have never been marginal to their own experiences. And also wanting to get into how communities in the 21st century are still relating to those 18th century experiences, whether it's in the case of, say, Native men who fought in the American Revolution, or Native women who remained at home and kept the communities going in extraordinarily important ways. So issues of gender. It has had to do with repatriation. So, material items, sometimes also ancestral remains that have been taken and dispossessed from communities in this era that now communities are working to bring home those ancestors and those materials. And then also to offer a different lens on the American Revolution as this time of purported liberty, freedom, equality, and to go much more in depth. What does that actually mean in the Northeast, when for many tribal nations, this is a time of intense struggle to maintain sovereignty, to devise different kinds of relations, to work across communities very diplomatically and strategically, and also relationships with African-American communities, because that is one of the most important stories in this region and cannot be isolated out from the rest of everything. So I'm at very early stages in that, which is why I don't have images and things, but a lot of the same process as what we've been talking about in terms of how this is coming together. And most of all, resistant to writing a kind of linear narrative that just marches through time, but instead is always thinking about the connections between the past and the present and the future.
At this time, I want to open it up to our audience. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to take yourself off of mute to present your questions. If you prefer, you can put them in the chat. I think we kept up with most of the I was trying really hard at that. All right. If there are no questions, then I just want to thank you again, Christine, for sharing with us today. And thank you for joining us for this author conversation, everyone. I just have a few announcements that I'd love to share before you go. We will be sending out a survey following this discussion, and we'd really appreciate your feedback to help us improve and grow. Our next session of Literature and Culture Author Conversations is scheduled for June 30th with Lisa Brooks, the author of Our Beloved Kin. We hope that you'll return for this free program. You can find the link to register on our website under the events page. You can see past virtual events like previous literature and culture author conversation sessions on our YouTube page. And on our events page, you can also sign up for our free Indigenous Author Book Club being held every Tuesday night with me. And our current book, we're actually finishing up, Gardens of the Dunes with Leslie Marmon Silko. We're going to be discussing it in its entirety. I highly recommend that book if you have not read it. It's fantastic. Join us for the We Are the Seeds virtual workshop on June 12th. It'll be a virtual workshop on creative repurposing with Dawn Spears. For registration and material information, there's a link in the chat. And also keep your calendars marked for our virtual honoring celebration. We'll be hosting the event via YouTube Live, and that'll be on July 29th at 7 p.m. And we just want to say thank you again to our funders at the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, USDA Rural Development, and New England Foundation for the Arts, and our generous donors. Please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Tamaqua Museum via our website. We continue to book virtual museum education programs for groups, schools, organizations. You can visit our website for details and give us a call to schedule your virtual visit. We are also now open. The museum is open again on Wednesdays and Saturdays. If you want to come visit us, we're back to our regular hours. And you can also support Tamaqua Museum by making a purchase in our museum store, either here or online. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next month for our next Literature and Culture Author Conversations. And with that, I can say Wuni Nakan, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really incredible.